Good afternoon, everyone, and my name's Stuart Peck. I'm the Director of Cybersecurity Strategy, and welcome to the final in Season 1 of ZeroDayLive. And today we're discussing knowing your threat landscape, and this is a subject that's very close to my heart as we get to talk about intelligence, and we get to talk about cyber threat intelligence, and we get to talk about open source intelligence. So there's a whole bunch of things that we get to talk about today. But before we do that, I guess if you haven't attended any of the previous sessions and you don't know who I am, I guess it's an opportunity for me to introduce myself. So I'm the Director of Cybersecurity Strategy, as I said. One of the areas of my areas of subject matter expertise that I've spent a lot of years working on and contributing to tools and in the community is open source intelligence and also cyber threat intelligence. I do other things as well, such as heading up the GRC team, and we're going to drill down into some of that experience and how that's going to come to play today. But of course, the session wouldn't be complete without my special guest, which is Mr. Steve Giachardi. And this is your third one, if I'm right?
Is it?
Number 3? Was it number 4? Number 4, actually, potentially, I think.
Good Lord. Good Lord. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Steve Giachardi, as Stuart said, and I'm the Information Security Manager here with ZeroDayLive. And I've got sort of a background in hands-on putting networks together and helping organisations check and get those networks compliant and secure.
Right, so let's dive straight in. One thing I should probably say actually before that, because I haven't done many of these before, is if you want to ask any questions today, make sure you use the text box or the chat box, which will be on either this side or wherever it may be, and ask any questions, and we will collect those questions and bring them to the end where we have some time at the end, about 15 or 20 minutes, maybe more, for any questions. So we'll do our best to get through all of those today. So thank you again for joining us, and I hope you find this enjoyable, informative, and also entertaining as well. So, I guess we should probably say, well, what is a threat? Because everyone goes, oh, threats, risks, vulnerabilities, aren't they all the same? Well, they're probably not, are they? They're definitely not.
Not really,
Not really, right? So, the definition of a threat, and there's a couple of definitions we use here, is a person or a thing or a service, whatever it may be, that's likely to cause damage or danger, or whatever it may be, right? So, for example, any person or tool that can take advantage of a vulnerability to compromise the confidentiality, integrity, or availability of an asset. So, i.e., the exploitation of a vulnerability, right? The ability to exploit that vulnerability. But in more kind of definite terms, this is the kind of thing that we're going to be talking about today. And this is a really good topic to start on because we can actually do a whole talk just on capability times 10, right? Because there's so many different dimensions to this. And luckily for everyone today, we're not going to do the whole talk just on this slide, but it's a very good starting point for us to have a discussion because we were talking about this literally just before we kicked this session off today about, what is capability and what is intent and how do those factors play in threat intelligence. And in this kind of example, we're talking about a vulnerability existing in a system. What is the capability, i.e. the tools and the tactics that are required to exploit that vulnerability? Does an exploit even exist? And we should definitely talk about that, right? And then, what's the intent of the attacker? What's the motivation? Or how much motivation or intent does the attacker need to have to be able to successfully exploit that, for example? So what's their motivations? What's their modus operandi? Are they looking to get kudos by doing it? Or are they looking for some kind of payoff?
But I think one of the things that we really should look at here is the capability, because I think there's a lot of situations here, or a lot of options that we're looking at. We're talking about threats, we're talking about vulnerabilities, we're talking about exploits. That you can have a vulnerability which is an exploit within an operating system, but that might be totally benign if you do not have the expertise and the ability, which therefore is that capability, to be able to turn that vulnerability into a threat, to be able to take advantage of it. And I think it's the capabilities that is, I think, the area really where the skills that we're trying to defend against are becoming more and more technical.
To add to that as well, Stuart, which is a very good point, this is something that we're definitely going to talk about throughout this session, but for me, it's also understanding the countermeasures, right? So understanding what countermeasures you have in place as an organisation, understanding that, and then also then being able to say, well, what would an attacker have to do to bypass this? What sort of steps do they need to go through? Can they just go directly to the user and phish them, and then that deploy an attack? And then would your controls prevent that attack from happening? The other aspect to this as well, which we'll definitely talk about as well, is you may have a vulnerability in a system, right, that exists. So there is a vulnerability. Let's say there's a vulnerability in Microsoft, and there have been many recently, but many high-profile ones. Right, we won't go pick on them too much, but let's for a second, right? And therefore, the next question you need to ask yourself and need to validate is: does an active proof of exploit exist, or proof of concept, whatever you want to call it, right? Does it actually exist, right?
And
so
if it exists, how difficult is it to execute?
Yeah, absolutely. So if it's a one-liner, like we've seen recently, you need to run a one-liner bash script and that's it. That's probably very highly likely that could be executed by pretty much anyone. So your capability of the attacker is anyone that can run this script, right? And obviously they need to then bypass your countermeasures. And the intent is, what's the payoff, right? What's the reason for doing this? If there is no current exploit in place currently, well, that is still a threat, because there is a threat that an exploit will at some point be developed, because in some cases a vulnerability may be identified by, say, a security researcher, and that security researcher has then identified the vulnerability, they've been able to exploit it, but then, say, the vendor or the company that's been publishing the patch hasn't actually disclosed obviously the exploit path. But when you then deploy a patch, attackers will then start to reverse engineer that patch to work out what was changed, the difference between the two operating systems were, what files were changed, all this kind of stuff, to work out what the potential exploit path is, so they can work out how to develop that exploit, and then you've got an exploit window, right?
Absolutely.
So because not everyone's going to patch immediately, right? No. So the threat is then also based on your exposure window, and is it something we need to focus on now? Or is it something we need to focus on, still a priority, but actually there might be something else that's more of a priority. So these are things that we're going to touch on today. And I think just this topic alone
That's
is
interesting, that the whole concept of the exposure window. I think maybe we ought to look into look through that window, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we'll touch on that in a second, because I think there's another part I want to talk about, which is, what is the threat intelligence lifecycle. So we're going to talk about, we've understood what a threat is now. And of course, part of that is to understand how do you identify threats and how do you pull data in to be able to develop intelligence around the threats that you may be exposed to, and how do you prioritise that, and actually, is that really a threat to your organisation? Of course, the intelligence lifecycle itself, is made up of these stages, which, if you look at them in their kind of isolation, don't really make much sense unless you're an intelligence specialist. So, planning stage, the collection, the processing, exploitation of information, the analysis and production of intelligence, and dissemination. And in essence, those kind of 5 steps are kind of the foundation of intelligence that has been generated and used as a foundation for years, developed by the CIA. Right, so direction in terms of its understanding what's the objective, what are we trying to gather intelligence on, what are we trying to validate, what are we trying to prove, right? Or what information have we been given already that we need to further validate to understand our exposure? And that's basically understanding what we're collecting, how we're collecting that information, what information are we collecting, what's useful. And a lot of people take, if you look at even open source intelligence, which we'll touch on later, a lot of people take data and say, I've now got intelligence. Unless you can do something with that information, so you might get a feed, right, and say, here's some malicious IPs. Great. What does that actually mean?
Then what are you going to do with them?
What does that actually mean to my organisation? I've got some malicious IPs. Okay, well, maybe we need to look at other sources of data. So let's look internally in the network. Are we seeing anyone connect out?
Yeah, is anyone going to these?
Yeah, exactly. So therefore, threats realised, right? Or are we worried about these things? Or what actually happens with these malicious IPs? Is there an exploit running on that site? Is that a sign of an act of exploitation that's already happened? So therefore, it's a command and control server. What does this actually mean? What do these domains mean? What services are running? What family of malware? What group is it? Is it evidence of a potential initial exploit? Maybe it's a command and control server that then later drops something like ransomware.
But where did we get this list of IPs from?
Well, exactly. That's the whole point.
Did how did we come across this list of IPs?
That's the whole point we're going to talk about in a second, because that is a very important question that I think we're going a slight ahead of ourselves on. But you're absolutely right. Where did we get the information from? Was it sent through a government agency?
Yeah.
Were we informed of it? Or was it part of
was it a hacker that just sort of slipped them to you?
Or maybe it's an alert from a SOC. But the whole point of intelligence is the fact that we need to make sure that we're sourcing, we've got our source, identified our source of information, right? Then processing that information to garner some form of actionable intelligence from that. We're going to do something with this. We're going to prioritise this. We're going to disregard all this, but we've got these different sources that corroborate something that we need to action. Okay, and then the analysis of production is basically to say we've done that, and then dissemination is like, who's it for? Now, ultimately, I'm not just going to use this slide to explain it, because actually that makes still no sense unless you actually understand the context of what we're talking about.
I have to be honest to say that for me, the whole phrase, the intelligence life cycle, when I look at it in the planning and direction, collection, processing, it doesn't really hang together. I understand what the CIA are getting at and where they're going with it. But for me, I always thought like the intelligence life cycle was, I found out this piece of information, but how long is that piece of information valid? Here's this exploit for Windows. We've now patched the server that exploit would have affected. That intelligence is now no longer a threat. So surely isn't that the life cycle that's been...
That is also part of it as well, because that comes into analysis and production, right? So
Okay.
What's our exposure window? What's our...
Well, we're back to our window.
Back to our window again, right? So we're going to come back to that, not windows, window, right? Or potentially both, right? So in actually that sense, what we're talking about here is the context, right?
So when we're looking on your diagram here, we're looking at something called the objective, okay? So is the objective to protect ourselves, or is the objective to find out the intelligence that we need to be able to understand the threats we're facing?
It's both, right? And it is both. And you say that, like, look in your face, you're thinking, well, you haven't really answered my question. But actually I have, because the objective of and this is the planning direction, what are we collecting, why are we collecting it, right? It's the most important question to answer. There's two ways you can look at it. One is to understand our current attack surface, which is kind of what we're talking about today, knowing your threat landscape. So what information is relevant to our business, right? What is relevant to our tech stack, is relevant to our industry we might be in, right?
May I, sorry to interrupt you, but can I just ask a question? Is there a difference between the threat landscape and the attack surface?
Well, threat landscape is a terminology that's used to determine what the landscape looks like from an intelligence point of view, right? So from what does the landscape look like for the industry in general or for that organisation? Your attack surface is very much more specifically targeted at you as an organisation in terms of your tech stack, your exposure windows, your points of vulnerability, right? So you can say they are related, because ultimately the attack surface is how exposed are we, what does our vulnerability look like, and where can an attacker inject, and then the threat landscape itself is very much what's happening out there and very much what we're talking about here.
So would I be right in thinking of the threat landscape is what lies underneath where your attack surface sits?
More or less, the threat landscape determines what's happening out there, right? So
Gotcha.
if we're seeing a rise in, and this is a terminology which I'm not a massive fan of, the threat landscape, right? Because it's so generic and everyone goes, this is your threat landscape, right? And actually, realistic, what we're talking about is what's happening out there that's important to me, right? Ultimately, everyone's threat landscape is based on their risk, exposure, you know, things they're particularly worried about, their industry. There are so many different factors to take into account. So my threat landscape would be different to yours, for example. So I don't want to touch on that point because we're going down a different rabbit hole, but you're absolutely right. It's a completely different rabbit hole. And then we can start playing buzzword bingo and all the other stuff that we could potentially everyone's probably doing on this call at the moment, right? So, but the point is, you know, we have an objective, right? And that objective, as you rightly said, is both those things. It's trying to understand what threats are out there that we potentially don't know about, but this exercise is to then uncover. So are there proof of exploits? Are there attackers talking about? Have we actually seen any of our data out there potentially? That means that our tools haven't detected a breach, but now we're detecting it for the first time. Worst case scenario, there could be an industry-wide breach of something, right? So there could be one tool used by an industry recognised tool that is compromised, and actually then all of our data is exposed, for example. That is something that could happen. So then we need to understand and validate, well, how did that happen? It could be, for example, an increase in attacks per industry, right? So these are whole things that we're talking about. But really what we're looking at is collection. Now, I've always believed in any form of collection or intelligence program, it's good data in, good objective out, right? So the better the quality of the data you collect, the more relevant the data you collect, or the more data you collect in some cases, right? If you get good quality data and volume of data and you can actually do something with that, you're always going to get a good outcome. What you don't want is data that's here's all the attacks happening across the industry, right? Versus here's all the attacks happening, right? I want to look at the attacks that are happening in my industry, or the attacks that are very specific to my tech stack or whatever it may be.
But even that right there is a challenge in and of itself, because from certain exercises that I've undertaken where I've gone and I've uncovered information, the importance of that information wasn't relevant until 2 or 3 other pieces of information were put together to provide, what was it you said, context for the item. Now, the challenge that I think I'm seeing here for people is, how can you determine when you're collecting good data? Because until you've caught the data and you've analysed it, you're not going to know whether it's good or not, are you?
Fantastic question. This is going to be a really hard question to answer really shortly. So,
apologise.
No, that's a really good question, right? And so there's a couple of things, right? So you've got one is the, okay, what am I collecting? It goes back to objective. What am I trying to prove here, right? Or what am I trying to uncover, right? So the data sources that you will use will determine whether you should actually do this. Are the data sources fit for purpose, for example? So if I'm trying to understand, I don't know, looking at my internal network, have I got the right logs? Am I logging the right information? So if I'm looking at network traffic, but I haven't got any network traffic analysis, then I'm not going to be able to find it, right? Externally, it's always a gamble, right? Because you've got to make sure, well, okay, I'm trying to uncover a problem, but I might not have the right data sources. So it's being aware of the fact that you might need to increase your data sources, or you might need to refine your data sources, or you might need to look at, actually historically what kind of information we collected, and is it going to help me solve this problem? So it goes back to verification analysis. Okay. You need to verify not only the data you're capturing currently, but looking historically how useful that data has been to be able to say, right, if I'm trying to solve this problem and I've not been able to answer it historically, is the data I'm capturing the right data? Do I need to refine my search? Do I need to increase the type of data I'm collecting? Do I need to look at different sources? So it's almost not a case-by-case basis, but it all comes down to the objective, right? What am I trying to answer in terms of questions, right? And how am I trying to answer that question as well in terms of the objective of that particular intelligence campaign? So a good example is, let's say I want to understand, okay, the number of ransomware attacks that are happening in my industry at the moment. I want to then look at, okay, so I want to look at any malware samples, I want to look at any industry-based reports, I want to look at what intelligence I'm getting from my malware vendors and all this kind of stuff, what other open source intelligence I can do and garner myself, and combine that all together and verify and go, this is my exposure. And also look at some of the intelligence sources that will give me some indicators in that. So actually being able to scrape on a regular basis the blogs and the sites and the areas where the attackers post information, so I can start to spot these things. And actually then that will give me an indication, is there an increase in these types of attacks, or is there a decrease? And then speak to my peers to understand what they're saying, to see what they're seeing as well, but I can verify that information. It's probably not the best example, but it's what I'm going to come up with right now, right? And then, the most important part out of all of this really, and I've got to be quite clear, is you might have good data, right? But if you don't understand your assets that you're trying to protect,
Absolutely.
and you don't understand who your audience you're trying to produce the intelligence for, doesn't matter how good the data is, the outcome is always going to be bad, right? Yeah. Or it's not going to be as good as it could be, right? So an example is, I know that there's an exploit that exists for this operating system, right? And it's a new exploit. It's working, people are using it, they're using it across the board, it's a low-level attack, but ultimately it's increasing in pace, right? And so we know that there's a lot of people trying to use this, and we can track this attack because we can see that the systems are affected. I could go to Shodan and I could find out, okay, they're targeting this type of systems, how many of these systems are ours, how many of ours are exposed, so I can then very quickly just go check our own attack surface that way by using Shodan. But I wouldn't really want to just use Shodan. I'd want to have an asset register that tells me we're running these types of operating systems, right? Yep. And I'd like to know which of those are public facing and which one of those potentially are running this operating system that is exposed. and how many of those have recently been patched, and what's the status of that patching, and also which one of those are critical, what systems are they connected to, and those big questions to ask, by the way, but then I now know that's my attack surface, right?
But these are questions that every organisation should be asking itself anyway, regardless of whether or not they're doing threat intelligence, regardless of whether they're doing... Because if I'm not mistaken, I think when we did our very first seminar, when we talked about incident response, good incident response starts with understanding your assets.
Well, it's not just the seminar that we did the first one, but we did the one we did last week, or even actually the one we did on supplier valuation risk management, understanding your assets there as well, right? So your suppliers and your assets, right?
It's interesting how central to security and how central to both defence, being absolutely secure, defending your environment, and being able to be tactical in the defences that you put to protect your environment, all seems to hinge around understanding what your assets are.
And there's a very good reason for that as well, and I think it's hopefully obvious to
Don't
people on
tell
this
me,
call.
it's later in the presentation.
No, it's not, actually, no. Well, it kind of is actually as well, because that's my answer to everything at the moment, but there's because it is coming. But here's my kind of rationale on this, right? So what I really sort of see here is being the kind of pivotal point with the topic today is that unless you understand those assets, you can't understand your exposure, right?
Yeah.
And, well, you can assume exposure, right, because you haven't patched.
Yep.
But then if you haven't got visibility of all those assets, you might miss an asset that's exposed, and therefore you have created an additional potential
you've created
risk.
your own vulnerability.
Yeah, you've created your own vulnerability, which could be exploited, right?
Yep.
So there is this real important part here. But then also understanding the audience. Let's talk about, let's say we've identified our assets, we know our assets, right? We've done that. Massive tick in the box, right? And we're up to date with our asset register. So we now know...
And they're patched.
And they're patched even better. Wow. Oh, we're getting really ahead of ourselves here, Steve, right? But yeah, they're patched as well, right? But we now understand we've got a vulnerability, we've got an exposure, right? But we're on top of it. But we still need to make sure that the board, the executives might be asking questions, because one of the questions, objectives could be, a very common one, what is our exposure to this, right? We are worried about this particular attack that's happening. Can you tell us our exposure? That's where intelligence comes in, right? We know internally, we're not seeing anything in the network. We know externally what our attack surface looks like, and now we can actually validate how prevalent this attack is, and actually we can then give some intelligence around the types of tactics, techniques, procedures, the type of attack vectors, indicators of compromise, so we can feed all that to the SOC to make sure that if we have a SOC, they're monitoring for these things implicitly, they're making sure they're detecting things, they've got the ability to detect. We have got now a plan of how this information feeds into our vulnerability management team, and most importantly, risk management and leadership, because we now got different audiences. So we've got tactical intelligence and we've got strategic intelligence.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Yep.
And actually knowing your audience is ultimately the most important thing, because one intelligence report, it might be the same intelligence, but the method of delivery and actually what information you extrapolate from what you've gathered is going to suit different departments.
Yeah, because the message you need to tell the board is slightly different to the message you need to tell the guys who are going to...
Yeah, absolutely. They're going to want to know the indicators of compromise, they're going to want to know the stuff that we're definitely going to talk about later when we talk about pyramid pain. You know, we're going to talk about all that kind of stuff, right? And I want to move on because I'm conscious of time. And we have touched on this.
Oh, look.
It's almost like we planned this or something, I don't know.
The importance of understanding assets.
But it is important, right? And I think, I don't want to labour the point on this, but there is, you know, there's a kind of precursor to this, which is very much about, you know, understanding not just the assets, but your environment, right? So when we talk about any type of intelligence, it's understanding, you know, what the social and economical status is around your business, the things that have an impact to whether an attacker would target you or not, or there's other factors that would affect and cause potential risk and damage to your business, right? So things like technological, right? We've talked about that. What does my tech stack look like? And so therefore, knowing what my tech stack looks like, what am I potentially exposed to? We've talked about vulnerabilities a lot, and I'm not going to go into that, but it might be that we're using a particular piece of software that is actually not necessarily exposed from a vulnerability point of view, but could be used in a supply chain attack, and we're overly trusting that, right? So there's the risk of that happening, for example, right? Economical situations. There might be events happening in the world where you operate that make you more of a prime target for an economical attack, right? So financial fraud and things like this, right? Political and legal, there's always going to be changes in regulation that have an effect. That also is an opportunity for insider attack and opportunities. So we need to understand how that might have an impact, right? Is any one of these you can kind of competitive? What's the risk of espionage? Are we seeing that? We're seeing our competitors beating us in every kind of deal? Are our tenders being leaked? Do we need to understand that, right? Is our pricing model leaked out there? Does our competitors have our pricing model? Is this something we should be worried about? Okay, how are they beating us? They may just be more competitive and they may be more aggressive, or they may have an unfair advantage.
Absolutely.
Right? So when we talk about threat intelligence, we're not just talking about, yes, this is primarily cyber intelligence, right? But these are all things that are linked, right? And then you have your internal environment, right? So the inside attack and how that actually works as well, right? So these are things to take into consideration. There are many, many, many factors to play here. And this is what we're looking at today, right? Now, we may have mentioned assets before. Did we mention assets?
I think we've mentioned
Did we mention assets? I'm pretty sure we did, right? Okay, but threat intelligence doesn't actually begin with A. It's not a spelling mistake. That's actually true, right? It does actually begin with A. Because if you don't understand your assets, then it's very hard to defend what you don't know about. Or not just necessarily defend, but get the right level of understanding where those assets might be exposed.
Understanding your attack surface, quite simply, because if you don't understand where your assets are and what the assets are, you can't understand what you're open to attack.
Absolutely. So I don't think we're going to go too much into what assets are, but the things we're looking at are...
No, they're just things with value to the company.
Pretty much. There we go. They're your critical assets, right? The critical assets, things that are valuable to the company. I think we might have laboured this point a little bit too much, but we are going to move on. But this is the key for me. The point is about prioritised, identified threats that can have the biggest impact to your most critical assets. So we used the example earlier on, okay, of the vulnerability, that there's a vulnerability in a system, there is potentially a patch available, but there's not a proof of exploit, right? Or proof of concept of an exploit. So we now know that there is something that's still a threat, potentially could be exploited, but the list or the groups of attackers that could deliver that at the moment is limited or potentially at the higher end of the spectrum.
We were talking about capability and intent earlier, and the capability to do that is quite, the capability required to take advantage of the exploit is high, but the rewards for doing so are really, really low, so there's not a lot of intent behind following that.
If you're a valuable target for that particular group, then maybe the intent is also, the intent might be quite high because the payoff is massive, right?
This is one of the things I was thinking about when we were talking about the defences that we put in front of assets to protect them. It's almost like... when we talk about kudos, it's like that the hackers look at this and they go, you know what, I just got to get through that and see, just to be able to say that, yeah, I did it. Yeah,
in some cases, kudos is enough of a motivator in itself, right? But the payoff, in most cases, for criminals and cyber criminals, is usually money, and for state-sponsored attackers is usually going to be IP or the political agenda, whatever it may be, right? So there's going to be a whole range of things. But I think the important thing here is that then we know that our critical assets are exposed to this, and what's really important here is about the continuous monitoring of those assets, because what we need to understand is threats change, right? So currently today, there is no proof of exploit, or there is a limited group of people that can deliver this exploit. Yeah. But 3 months' time, that's completely changed. So unless we're monitoring our potential vulnerabilities and our risks, and we potentially decide not to patch this, because there may be this one system we just can't patch. It's running an outdated software, or maybe it's so critical that our change request window is once a quarter to do that, for example, because it runs a process, and that's the change request window we've got for that. So taking those environmental considerations into place and taking into consideration the fact that our situation has changed.
So you're talking about your internal environmental situations because you've got your patch window, and then you've got to look at your external considerations, because now this exploit might have been programmed by somebody, a script written which will exploit that.
Which usually happens anyway, right? As soon as you're sort of monitoring GitHub like this, or a 0 day today, or wherever it may be, right? So all the sites that where you'll see these things running, you need to think about what the exploit window looks like. And actually now we know there's a patch we can't patch. An exploit is not so much of an issue at the moment because we've got this quarterly window, but we know that suddenly that deadline's coming. We have to continue. It's like monitoring risk, right?
Absolutely.
You can accept the risk, but you still need to monitor for change.
Still need to monitor it, yeah.
Exactly. It's the same thing with threats. Threats change, evolve.
Yeah.
Capabilities change. We have to continuously monitor our attack surface to understand where we're exposed. I know we talked about attack surface a lot, but that is actually really important, right? Now, we could say this diagram to me really pretty much sums it up, right? Knowing your threats, understanding your assets, and your vulnerabilities helps us understand where to prioritise our risks, right? Where our risks are. I think everyone on this call hopefully knows this, but I think it's important to say that the two parts of the things we discussed today are really important to understand your vulnerability, because actually without actually understanding the context of the threats and understanding the capability and the intent, understanding the value of the asset and the importance of the asset and what it could impact, is it confidentiality, integrity or availability, and which one of those three is going to cause you the most damage, right? Which then understands what your vulnerability is, what does an attacker have to do to get to that vulnerability, will determine the level of risk, right? So these are the kind of things that we always talk about, and it's vitally important as part of this kind of discussion. I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that.
No, I think you've summed that up beautifully.
Well, on that note then, we'll move on. But let's see, this is the important thing, right? So one of the things we always talk about, and I think this is really important, is like, how does like intelligence support business objectives? Because this is, you know, we're not just talking about attackers, we're talking about, well, there are many benefits to doing anything, and we're not talking about, you know, buy this tool and get all these benefits. In most cases, intelligence isn't always based on a tool, it's based on information. You can do intelligence now, today, just by even setting up Google Alerts, for example, or subscribing to or downloading free intelligence feeds, putting that information together, leveraging that with any in-house monitoring tools you have. You know, it's about collecting, processing, doing something with the data, right?
But I think really you mentioned this earlier in the talk this afternoon, because you said that the intelligence can be used in two ways. You can use it strategically for the board to be able to advise the board about the things and the threats that they're going to be facing, and you can use it tactically when you're working down with the IT support team to be able to put those fixes in place to be able to thwart those vulnerabilities. It
is like, in some cases, boiling the ocean as well, right? And that's kind of how I feel as well. It's sometimes, you know, if you are a very large organisation, this is not something you can do, you know, without actually really thinking about, you know, who's going to take this information, what are we going to do with it, and actually having strong objectives, right? So if you're taking this for the first time, saying we're going to properly do intelligence, we're going to do open source intelligence, or we're going to buy a tool, or we're going to buy a service, or you still need to do the same thing. Why are we doing it? Right? Yeah. What is our objective? What's our objectives, right? And it's really important, right? What are we looking to get?
This takes us right back to the beginning of the life cycle, because we're now talking about planning and objectives.
Absolutely, and there's kind of areas where I think good intelligence is important and what it does for the organisation. So obviously, you'll be able to identify indicators of compromise or indicators of attack. I would rather focus on indicators of attack, because you haven't actually been compromised at this point. So what are the things that are happening that are early indicators of someone having a go? That's great. I want to see that, right? I want to see that. That's more sort of signal intelligence, so my SOC and all this kind of stuff. Maybe seeing those early indicators might be tools that you have that give you those kind of leads of, well, okay, this is something to look into. Nothing has been successful yet, but someone's having a go. Right? Indicators of attack, much more interesting than the indicators of compromise, because yes, everyone loves talking about IOCs, but really we should be thinking about how can we get our program to think about IOAs, right? Yeah. In this case of attack, that someone's having a go, rather than, oh, they've already had a go, they've been successful, and now we've got some artefacts. A lot worse, obviously.
It's much worse.
It's a bit late at that point,
it's
right?
Too late.
But it's still important, right? It's still important in that process, right? So, yeah, it might just be the, you know, the obvious kind of most sort of normal scenario of like phishing attack, right? So that is an indicator of compromise. Someone successfully got a phishing email through our controls.
But if we look at IOAs and indicators of compromise and indicators of attack, we can't begin to understand these things until we know what our normal looks like. And I think this again is somewhere where we have to go. We have to be able to baseline and understand what normal looks like to be able to identify those indicators of attack.
Yes, and also no. And you know I was going to say this, right? Because we might have talked about this before, right? So yes, absolutely right. From a signal intelligence point of view, from a SOC and from a inside tooling, all this kind of stuff, 100% baselining is important, right? Because ultimately, you're looking for abnormalities within network traffic, and that's where it's absolutely important. From an outside external perspective, looking at what attackers are doing, we need to be able to identify what the indicators of compromise look like from an attacker point of view, so we can spot those if they were to happen. And also before that, we need to identify what the early indicators of attack are, so what's the route the attackers will use to deliver.
Where are they coming? Where do I need to look to be able to defend myself against this attack?
Absolutely. So therefore you can then baseline with that information, right? Because you can then go, I'm now pinpointing, I'm worried about this thing over here.
Yeah, this is what it looks like on my day-to-day basis. Yeah. Why on Thursday did I have all these sudden spikes? Where did they come from? Now I can backtrack to see what was going on.
Yeah, for example, we can start thinking about things like Qbot and things like this are really big at the moment, right? So sort of Trojans and malware and things like this. But we can actually start saying, well, actually, what are the common areas where this attack will exploit, and what files? So we can start saying, well, these Windows processes, if we see any DLLs execute against those processes, system 32, such and such and such, against this file path, we know we potentially have a compromise. So we've now got granular detail we can go into to say we need to monitor for that, right?
Yeah, but again, we're talking about we've potentially got a compromise. We need to try to get the other side of that. We need to try to be looking to see how that attack would be coming into our organisation.
Correct. And sometimes you have to look at all the potential tactics, techniques and procedures. And we're going to talk about this in a second, because how is an attack going to deliver? Because it could come over phishing, it could come through third-party compromise, could come through a user bringing a device that's already compromised into the network, right?
It could come through that USB stick that's tossed in the car park.
Which no one ever plugs in, of course.
Never pick that
up. No. So, you need to understand, again, what is the attack vectors, right?
Yeah.
And actually being able to then look at those. But in most cases, it is going to be phishing, or it's going to be some kind of drive-by or some kind of compromised website or something like that, right? But then, again, watering hole attacks are also quite popular as well. If I know that I compromise XYZ site, I'm going to collect the people that would normally go to that site, and therefore my window of exploitation is quite big. But we haven't even really talked about this actually too much. We just got this whole lovely slide over. We just got lost in this conversation, which is a good thing. But back to your point. Okay, back to your point is, we need to be thinking about what data we're collecting. Is it structured, unstructured? Is it semi-structured? What are we actually looking to do? What type of intelligence are we looking to get? Are we looking at the kind of malware stuff? We're looking at dark web intelligence. We're looking at signal intelligence. How are we collecting that, right? And then actually we're looking at doing the threat assessment. So actually looking at that and going, all this data, what's the capability and intent of the attackers? What's our exposure? What's our vulnerability? How does that feel? What's the likelihood of action? What's the likelihood of compromise potentially, right, in this type of information? Because again, although we're looking at the path of how someone might be attacked, it doesn't necessarily mean that could happen to us. What we're threat at the moment is, it's a threat of something happening, right? The point it is realised it's then an attack, and therefore we're talking about a compromise, and therefore we're talking about risk, and we're talking about exposure and things like this, right? But ultimately, this creates, in most cases, an indicator of compromise or indicator of attack. We now know enough about this particular scenario to be able to understand what is happening, right? And in most cases,
or what could potentially happen.
Well, yeah, and what is happening and what could potentially happen, because ultimately you have active campaigns, right?
Absolutely.
So therefore, we know these are the type of things that are happening actively out there, which allows us to ascertain what preventative actions we may need to take, right? Or we may already be exposed to it, and we need to understand where we need to look to find it, right? Because it's got through our control. So what information do we need to do from a threat hunting perspective? So this takes me into the angle of how intelligence supports threat hunting, right?
Absolutely,
which is the proactive rather than reactive, waiting for an alert to go off in the SOC, which is one way of doing it. The other way is actually progressively and proactively and aggressively hunting for signs of intrusion, looking for the indicators of compromise, knowing where to look, knowing how to look for it, and knowing what information to use internally to be able to help you do that. Okay, and in some cases, that could just be looking through certain file directories and checking for changes, doing integrity checks, things like this. In some cases, it could be taking your logs and actually building up proactive threat hunting use cases and alerts, right? And where you don't have SOC capability, so it gets a little bit more challenging, right? So, and that's where it becomes quite difficult, and it is quite difficult, but we still...
Because this is the thing that we're not really mentioning, and it's kind of crucial, is that it's quite labour intensive doing threat intelligence, and actually being able to sit down and look through logs is a labour intensive process.
Yes, absolutely. It is a labour-intensive process, and also we have to bear in mind that the intelligence is the gathering of information and processing and analysing it, and then the SOC analysis stuff is usually done by... But the two roles are very closely linked, because your SOC might be an intelligence analyst.
Yeah, and this is assuming that the business has got a SOC. It's for businesses that don't have a SOC and that don't have that capability. This kind of stuff becomes extremely challenging.
Well, yeah, that's why services are quite useful for this, right? So
Absolutely.
this is where people then turn around and say, well, do I need intelligence? Because that's an important thing. People might go, is it a nice to have? Or is it something I can build internally capability for myself? Because maybe they might be thinking, okay, this comes back down to procedures, right? So let's talk about instant response, because I want to go into this cycle here, right? So intelligence supports monitoring activities. That's your threat hunting, right? And that's also your existing SOC, or could be log management, could be a NOC, could just be support desk, could be anything, right?
Yep.
Okay, could be, but there is a capability here that we need to think about. Right? On the other side, how does it support incident management? So let's say you don't have a SOC, right? Just for example, right? But you find that we detect something quite late in the process, right? You still need intelligence during an incident, hopefully before something happens, right? But you still need intelligence to be able to then tell you what's happening and what you need to look for. When an incident's happening, you need intelligence to understand and get situational awareness.
Absolutely you do, yeah.
And you need it after an event, because ultimately you need to understand, well...
How did that happen, and what can we do to stop it from happening ever again?
And what actually happened, right? Is our data actually out there? But is it being solved? Is it solved? Maybe it's being solved as well. Maybe they're doing that, right? So the point is, there is multiple things that we need to use intelligence. There's so many use cases, and I don't want to go and labour the point here, but it supports multiple business functions. And just going into my favourite subject, which is like how you collect this data and what you can actually collect, and hash values, right, of any kind. Anyone's done any kind of threat hunting investigation, any kind of malware analysis, or any kind of indicator of attack or indicator of compromise analysis. You know, there's loads of things to actually look out for, right? And my favourite is obviously hash values. They're pretty trivial to kind of get and to understand. You know, chuck a hash into file hash into virus total. You'll pretty much find, is it malicious, not malicious? You might be able to actually take different values out of different documents to understand, actually, is it the same campaign? Is it a different campaign? You know, IP addresses, usually fairly easy to get. You know, domain names and things like this, fantastic. Actually, domain name analysis is also very useful to understand what domains are linked to other domains, potentially other services, DNS records, things like this. Obviously, with Whois records, have done a great job for attackers with GDPR, protecting, registering, making those OPSEC fails they used to make. But actually, what you can actually see from that as well is campaigns and IP addresses, and those IP addresses are probably going to be quite useful to understand. Are they using shared services? Are they using, is this a command and control framework, or is this something that's hosting something else? Network and host artifacts are actually quite difficult to obtain. If you're dealing with an attacker that actually understands anti-forensic techniques, and anti-detection and evasion techniques, in most cases you probably won't get very much from that, unless they have seen before where attackers actually left a staging server on the network with all their tools in it. That's actually quite useful, because you can then get quite a lot of artifacts and you can lose quite a lot of information. But that's a rarity, or that's when they've been rumbled early in the process.
Before they've had a chance to clear up after themselves.
And if you're looking at malleable frameworks such as, you know, Cobalt Strike and things like this, it becomes very difficult to gather and garner any host artifacts or network artifacts, because the idea of frameworks like Cobalt Strike is that you can change the headers to hide in plain sight the traffic. You can inject or hollow existing processes and things like this. So the idea is, once it's in and once that process is executed, every bit of data I'm sending out is looking like it's a file or looking like an image being uploaded to Facebook, and it's not at all. Hiding the artifacts becomes very, very difficult. So very difficult for defenders to uncover. That's the whole idea of these frameworks, is it's not to be detected in the first place, right? And then tools. What tools are you using, right? So if you've done a good job hiding your network and host artifacts, and my IDS can't detect the C2 beacon because it looks like legitimate traffic because I'm masking, I'm encrypting, you know, all this kind of stuff, then actually it becomes a really, really important process to be able to then do that, right? And actually you're not going to find the tools. And then actually then getting to tactics, techniques and procedures, understanding the operational model of an attacker, understanding how they're funded, what happens to the data, what their process is, what tooling they used, what their attack model is, how they move on. So do they deliver a multi-stage attack? They start to deliver a easy attack to test the defenses of a network, and do they move on to more the technical attacks? What's the process? What's the timeline of being on the network? What's their likelihood of moving around, pivoting? How do they target specific industries? What type of data they usually go after? You know, all of that stuff, right? All of those kind of literally playbook level type information is very tough, okay? And it takes a while, and in some cases you'll never get it, right? And because the attacker's any good, they haven't been caught yet. So, you know, and therefore there isn't, they haven't been identified as a group, right? There's just, you're attacker A in that sense, right? And we know very little about you apart from the fact you might look like another type of attacker. Do they reuse, you know, can we do like the whole, you know, like the whole gang crab kind of thing, right? With ransomware as a service. Was gang crab actually, you know, R-Evil or Revil, depends on how you want to pronounce it? Most likely, because the source code was the same, the techniques were the same. You know, did they learn from their mistakes when they did their exit strategy? Who knows, right? Or did they just sell the source code, right? There's lots and lots of different ways. Most likely they were the same group, but the point is, there are certain things that you can point to go, I know the source code of this. It's the same source code, the same comments, the same style.
But then what's interesting though is if we focus on that ransomware for a bit, is the way that the methodology now has changed by the attackers. Because where before they used to just encrypt all your data and then say to you, right, you need to pay us X number of bitcoins to have your data back. Now what they're doing is releasing some of your data onto lists to prove that they've got your data and encrypting your drives.
And in some respects, that's a terrible tactic for attackers in terms of that's for victims. Great for intelligence, though. Right? Absolutely great for intelligence, because I now can just go to their blogs, scrape it, know who the new victims are, right? And now know, okay, from an industry point of view, who's been affected by industry, and are they likely to go after me, or was it completely random, right? So you're going to like, okay, thank God it wasn't me, right? And so you can actually start to do that, and you can start to monitor those things. But yeah, you're absolutely right. It's bad. You can also see the data gets downloaded. And sometimes it is a bluff, and sometimes the data they have is like, oh, it's a PowerPoint presentation. Fantastic. It's not really valuable, so what else would they likely have? Or they save the best data because they want to sell it, right? Never know, right? Yeah. You know, the samples are hard to go by, but the point is, it's something to talk about. And actually, talking about ransomware, this is completely unintentional that we actually talked about ransomware. I just thought it was a great example. You know, knowing TTPs. Now, TTPs in this particular case is knowing what to expect and how to expect it. I'm not talking about the whole playbook, but ultimately here we need to understand what's the root of the attack, initial compromise, or what's the route that it might be an indicator for attack to understand that we might be exposed to this. So knowing that we've got a vulnerable VPN and we haven't patched it yet is always going to be a risk. Knowing that we might have, we've identified a beacon that looks like it's a known Trojan, that then we now know that with this particular known Trojan, we know we could expect Conti ransomware, for example, is something to worry about, right? Yeah. So we now know we need to do something pretty quick. If we're going to know we found that and we know what's coming next, that's actually quite important to take action. Over here, what signal intelligence can we get as well? So what are we seeing across it? What should we be looking for across the network, across the devices to be able to detect these things? And ultimately, understand the attacker's objectives. There's lots of information we can gather from all these things to be able to make that kind of that decision, right? And I've used this in previous presentations, but from a slightly different lens. You know, the same information can be used again from a detection point of view, but also from a practice for intelligence. These are things that we need to be knowing about now, so we can then monitor these things. Hopefully, we can detect these things early in the process.
Yep.
Not when it's too late, when they've already got our data, right? So it helps with defence, it helps with staying on top of things, right?
So A before C, attack before compromise.
Exactly, yes, absolutely. So we haven't really answered the question, right, that we asked at the beginning of the presentation. How does it support business objectives? Well, it really helps, you know, identify potential exploitation or risks and indicators of compromise. Right? It helps strengthen that monitoring capability, okay, that we've just talked about a lot, which I'm not going to talk about again. Helps with strategic and tactical security decisions. If I know that there's a lot we're exposed to, or the industry is exposed in a certain way, or my industries might be exposed to a lot of attacks, and we haven't invested in the right defences, it can help with business cases at a strategic level, right? Saying that we are seeing our competitors or people in the industry being attacked this way, we know it's happening, we feel we're also exposed, that puts that into the executive's lap to say, we need to do something about this, and this is how we need to do something about this, and these are things you need to do. So it can actually help inform tactically. Tactical intelligence is, as we said, it's in the weeds. This is stuff we need to be monitoring.
Yeah,
things
we can understand where the attack's likely to come from and the defences we need to put in place. But I do think the strategic side is very important because we can help now by putting together a business case, maybe, for example, for getting an outsourced SOC in place, for the costs that might be such that it would be better to have that there than not, because the risks of not having it there, if the business was compromised, far outweighs the cost of putting a SOC in place.
It does, and if you look at context is important.
Context is king.
Absolutely, every time, right? So it's data until you have context.
Yeah.
Right? And context gives you the ability to make it actionable, and actionable intelligence is the form of intelligence you want to be generating. Right?
All the time. Yep.
If you just got data, that's great. Data's good. Fill your data lake, please. You actually pick out the bits you can do something with, right? Yeah. Okay, and that comes from your people in your organisation, understanding your assets, understanding your exposure, understanding what it actually means, and and having an objective of what we're looking to what questions we're looking to answer, right? Or what things we're looking to find. And we'll talk about this later. I keep saying that. Maybe we should have like a counter running for saying how many times.
But it's interesting. It's interesting though, Stu, because every time we start to talk and we start to diverge off, we always come back to saying that we need to understand our people, understand our assets, understand the threat, know what our objectives are. Because if we don't have those foundations in place, all of this just doesn't hang together.
Well, it's just data.
It's just data. Yeah.
Data, part of processing and analysis to pick out those things is what turns data into intelligence. Right?
Absolutely.
And then actually, from intelligence, we can then create actionable intelligence, because actually we're saying, hey, we're going to be attacked, but not knowing what to do about that situation means that it's intelligence. Yeah. So it's like saying, oh, well, there's a risk your house you've got a faulty plug or something in your house, and that could cause a fire risk, right? That's a threat, something might happen, right? Mm-hmm. Not knowing what plug it is and where it's located in your house and what to do to stop that from happening, that's the actionable intelligence I want to know. I need to know exactly what plug it is, I need to know exactly what part of the house it's in, I need to know what to do about it. That's actionable intelligence, right? Those things collide together, right? I've missed one point there, and we've talked about it already, but the point is that continuously monitor, right? Things change. We've talked about it earlier, so I don't really want to talk about that, right, so too much, because we've already talked about that. We haven't really talked about open source intelligence. Maybe we have, but we haven't really talked about it, right? Because ultimately, you can pay for, and I've got this statement that I want to talk about, that you have intelligence, and all these paid sources of intelligence, right, ultimately, to some most degree, most likely open source intelligence, with some expert analysis on top of that, right? The sources they've collected from, in most cases, unless they're doing proper human intelligence, where they're actually infiltrating groups, pulling this information apart and providing tactics, techniques, procedures of groups they've infiltrated, it's primarily open source to some degree, because you could actually collect this information yourself, but really what you're paying for is someone else doing it for you and giving you the stuff that you need to know, and hopefully then disseminating that in a way that you can then use it, right? So open intelligence is really publicly or widely available information. It addresses a specific intelligence requirement for you, right? So actually, you could generate your own intelligence, open source intelligence program today by using similar tools that exist out there, free tools, that's the whole point, to access information and then pulling into a source of information you can then analyse and index, right? And most people would do this anyway, to some degree, when you're getting a threat intelligence briefing from SANS, for example, right? SANS send out a intelligence briefing telling you what's happening in the month. That is a form of intelligence, right? You're being told by SANS, these are things you should be worried about. These are things that are happening at the moment, right? That's a form of intelligence. That is very tactical, but it is to some degree not really actionable, but it tells you there's something you need to do about a thing, right? On the more open side, we want to be collecting lots of information, processing it, and then finding out how that affects us as an organisation, right? In this case, I kind of like this is the process that I develop. When I do open source intelligence myself on a person or a company or a threat actor group or whatever it may be, the kind of process I use is this process. I will then look at what am I doing? Am I looking at doing scraping of social media? Am I domain mapping? Am I doing a tech stack recon? Am I looking into a group? And all those processes are the same. I might be looking into a threat actor group. I might be looking into understanding what malware's out there, whatever it may be, right? I'll do my data harvesting, right? So I'll actually do my automated collection. And just to tell everyone this call, there is going to be a list of tools that I use and how I use them. I was just about to ask you. Not in this presentation, though. No.
We'll be coming on to that later.
Much later, maybe after we send out the white paper. But the point is there will be a list of tools that we'll be sharing after this, so you can have a play around with them and some recommendations and things like this. But ultimately, for me, Google Foo, in terms of doing Google dorking and things like this, are really, really important. That's really important in any case, because you'll find what you need to at a high level. Then we start talking about the kind of public records and databases and things like this, data processing. So there's two parts to that. You've got data scrubbing out the data I don't really need, or contextualizing that data, and then also visualization. Actually understanding, visualizing data is quite important, right, to be able to make decisions on it. And then enrichment. So that's the vital part to this. Let's say adding data to get context. I've got this IP address. That looks interesting. I need to find out everything about that IP address now. I'm enriching that data. So I've got an IP address that looks interesting. I've got a hash that looks interesting. Now I'm enriching it. I'm finding out more about it. I'm pivoting, right? And then I'm doing the analysis. I'm linking that data together. I've now got 4 or 5 really useful bits of information that are now telling me much more than I knew 20 minutes ago, right? And then I'll pivot.
But the thing is though, the reverse of that is also true, because this is one of the routes that attackers do, where attackers will get a little bit of information from over here, a little bit of information over there, put the two together, and they've suddenly discovered that they know where your database server is.
Oh, yeah, it's the same. The process, I mean, I do this from the perspective of an attacker.
Yep.
And I can do it from a defender's point of view, right? That comes down to the very thing I'll talk about is objective. Right?
See, one of the things that you showed me that really I think I found quite surprising was a methodology for being able to understand the tools that you would need to attack a company by looking at the skills requirements that they put in their job vacancies.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. One of my favourite places to go for, and it's probably in here somewhere, maybe it's in there, I don't know if I can put it to this point, but is actually job specs.
Yeah.
Job specs, go scrape the last 6 months worth of job specs of Google Indeed, scrape all the keywords, look at what their tech stack looks like. Yep. So what's their development stack look like? What's their tech stack look like? Look at all the security jobs they're advertised. I now know what I need to bypass. I know what tools and what exposure they've got. It's 10 minutes of work, right?
Yeah.
And I can then, if I'm
and now I'm ready.
I now look at their job page and the website and go, so right, brilliant, fantastic. Their job page tells me the company culture. Do they have any certain benefits and requirements? They might have videos. I did one the other week when I was doing some open source intelligence into a company I was going to use from a physical security point of view, and I just watched videos of their building that had been built like years ago, and they had all the videos of people walking in. I know the timings of the doors, I knew the building layout looked like, a whole lot, just from watching their Join Us page, and so like there's just so much information you can gather just from that perspective, but from an intelligence perspective it's still the same.
Yeah.
Okay, it's context. It's all about context.
All about
context. And actually it's about pivoting, right? So there's 2 ways you pivot. You enrich the data and go, yeah, I've got information here. I now have developed enough information to complete that particular mission so I can push it back to the well. I don't have enough data, so I might go and pivot again to get more information and go back to that harvesting process. It's a continuous cycle of pivoting, and pivoting is your most important bit, because the analysis then gives you, the more you pivot, the more analysis you can do, the more data you can get. Okay? I don't know why I did that.
What did I say? You're going to burst into song there, the more you pivot.
I mean, you're thinking pirouette, right? But yeah, and this is where it gets, I don't know, my clicker's not working now. There you go, right. Okay, so let's talk about, with 30 minutes to go or so, with 15 minutes of questions, the last 15 minutes of our presentation.
Gosh.
That's flown by, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Seriously flown by. I've really enjoyed this. Hopefully everyone else in the session has enjoyed it as well. But I have like quick wins, and I'm thinking if I'm starting my intelligence practice today, right, I'm starting from scratch, what am I going to start with, right? If I'm looking at our exposure and vulnerability. So I want to look at, okay, malware and phishing.
What do I need? What do I need to be able to start doing this? Because it's all very well saying, yeah, I'm going to start gathering threat intelligence. Do I need to have a box to do this from?
That's a very good question. Look, there are different ways of doing it, right? So you can actually say, well, I could use, I don't know, let's say, you could use a Linux VM and think, okay, can I collect it that way and build all the tools and get an open source intelligence VM and build all those. There's actually some very good ones out there. There's actually a really good one for threat hunting. There you go. There's that's a special sound. There you go.
Clearly been bugged.
Right. So there's a special sound to say we win a special prize. But there's that perspective.
So is it actually worth doing that? Is it worth getting something like the Oracle VM and VirtualBox and spinning up a Kali server and
I wouldn't use Kali.
You wouldn't?
Not for this. No. There's actually I'll provide a list of OSINT VMs you can use. I've built my own as well, which is really good. But the point is, I would have that on hand for off-network stuff, right? So okay. I wouldn't be using it in the corporate environment, but for off-network, for investigations, having a box ready to go to deploy. Really, for me, I want to be. If it was me, I'd have something like a Kibana instance, something like that. Open, free tier, whatever it may be, the open source version.
Yep.
I'd be then putting data feeds into that and actually then building out my intelligence and creating search index and patterns and data sets from that, if it was me. Because that's what I do currently anyway, right, for this type of stuff. And then or MISP as well, which is another one, which is open
MISP.
source.
Yeah, is that MISP?
Yeah, there's a open source intelligence collection analysis framework, and you can actually collect data from different MISP instances and things like this and subscribe to those. As another way of doing it, or Taxi or Sticks as well. Again, provide all this sort of stuff. This is a whole different topic altogether. But there are different ways of collecting those intelligence.
So these tools are there. They're free tools that people can go and.
Absolutely, yeah. And there are commercial versions of all these tools, but the free versions, even a Multigo, even the Multigo stuff is pretty good. Personally, there are tools that I would use if I'm doing an investigation that are commercial tools that I highly recommend that are helpful. One of those is Huntley, for example, which is a very good tool that we use here for our investigation. Case management tools are really important if you're doing a manual investigation into something. There are other tools available as well, just to say that, but there are tools I would use. Here, these are the open free sources, right? So, like I said, abuse.ch, absolutely fantastic. Anything abuse.ch, fantastic, free, API, data.
Excuse me.
That's fine, no worries. And of course, resources, such as Threat Miner is a brilliant resource for information on APT groups, tactics, techniques, procedures, any threat reports, superb. Threat Crowd for looking into domains, and also the fact, APT Notes is also a great source of information. We'll show you this in a second, right? Obviously, for domain stuff as well, I'd also use things like Multigo, Sublister for identifying your own attack surface and subdomains. And you could look into attackers as well, by the way. If you find a top-level domain and actually find, there's actually a domain that you've identified that has got, such and such.com, can identify all of the subdomains that exist off that.
So Sublister will help you to find those subdomains?
Yeah, absolutely. Throw Sublister at it. You can even do the same with DNS Dumpster as well. Don't forget, you can do the same sort of thing, identifying subdomains, what they look like. And then, of course, Spiderfoot's absolutely fantastic. Love it. It's brilliant. Exploits, you could look at the CVEs that drop through MITRE. You could look at Zero Day Today to see if any exploits are actually being sold at the moment. It's not the best tool, but it's one of them. NCSC, if you're not a member of the Cyber Information Sharing Program for CISP, absolutely recommend it. Also, because we're a member, if you want someone to sponsor you, happy to be one of those people to help sponsor you as well, if you're not a member of CISP. And GitHub as well. Scrape GitHub for any exploits. It's absolutely fantastic. There's loads of tools to do that. And IOC feeds, Mr. Looker is a fantastic IOC feed. Absolutely brilliant. You're going to cough again, aren't you?
I'm going to cough too.
That's fine, don't worry about it. It's fine.
Excuse me.
Thought I'd just pre-warn our audience in case there
Thank you, I do apologise.
And company like Google Alerts using Dorks, things like this. And we have provided a list of resources in the white paper that you don't have yet, but you will have soon. So, there's the things that we're going to talk about. Here's some examples, like I said, Mr. Looker, right? For example, great tool, you can get JSON file, you can use CSV, sticks, there is also other feeds you can look at. It's absolutely fantastic. Like I said, APT notes and GitHub, you can pull that down. It's really good, really useful. Steve's just been passed some cough medicine. There you go, look at that. Nice and handy. And of course, again, like I said, abuse.ch, the URL house is fantastic if you're looking for any intelligence leads into any type of domains, malicious domains that are being used. You can use the API. It's really, really useful. Access their database. I use those kind of things all the time. We haven't really talked about is Google Dorking as well. So I actually create, I actually look at Google, creating a list of Google Dorks that I have to pick out certain piece of information. I create Google Alerts for it. So if I get hit, I get an email from Google saying, hey, a new search results appeared on this. And usually that's quite a useful way to find out if something's out there or certain type of text files that might be dropping with your domain in it and stuff like that. You can do some really cool stuff. That's free way of just getting an early notification if something bad's happened, right? And I've got hundreds of these dorks running, hundreds and hundreds of them running on whole different topics that just basically, if I get an email from one of those to a specific email account, I know something's going wrong. And then I get another email that comes in that says, also, this email has been, they've got a new email in this email account as well. So I now know it was an early warning system for me. And things like, look at OSINT framework. I've got a couple of things that are running in here as well, but I highly recommend just getting familiar with that. There's so many different tools and sources of information just there alone to keep you busy pretty much for a very long time. And
I was blown away when I went to the OSINT framework. I didn't realise there were so many different tools available.
Yeah, I've got a couple of listings of some stuff that I've built in there as well, which I'm quite happy about as well, which is always quite nice to know. Shameless plug, right? But, you know, it is really quite important. It's a really great resource. I use it all the time. It always gets updated. It's a pretty visual way to actually look at some sources.
So how did you get into open source? What was it that drew you into doing OSINT?
It's a really good question. I didn't really cover that at the beginning, did I? I've been doing this for like longer than I can remember.
Longer than I can remember.
It pretty much feels like that, doesn't it? It's just a lack of hair. Years of experience. That's where it's come from, right? I think,
yeah, but what attracted you to it?
I think I always, so when I first started out, before information security, I got really interested in Google Dorking and things like this when I was doing recruitment back in like 2003 in information security, before even LinkedIn was a thing. Finding CVs on the internet that people had left, like for example, like on the job boards hadn't locked themselves down, so you actually were able to get through the paywalls, for example, and get free CVs. A really good technique, not obviously. I got in trouble for that as well, actually, a little bit. I actually got banned from LinkedIn for 6 months as well. That's a whole different topic for doing the same sort of thing, right? But you know, the idea is that to try and find information. I got really interested in that, saying what information is actually out there just through Google itself, right? And it was about 2004, 2005. I still really got into it, and I just always had a love for finding hidden information and actually then taking that skill set and building upon it further and realising that it's not just Google Dorking, it's lots of other stuff. And so when I came into information security, it was the thing that really drove a lot of my interest into understanding someone's digital footprint, to understanding using the same skill set. It's I always call it the Swiss Army knife of skill sets. Yeah. You can apply that one particular skill set to everything, to finding missing people, which is what I do quite a lot, to doing CTFs and winning competitions.
I was going to say, because one of the things that one of the little sort of training sessions that you sat down with myself and the GRC team was you showed us a couple of pictures of images and you said, right, tell me where that is. And then you just walked off and left us to it. And then you came back and we'd all had our stabs at it and you walked us through how to use Google Image to do geolocation and all the rest of it.
Yeah, and Yandex and there's like...
Fascinating.
And there's a whole, you know, you've got geolocation and talent. We haven't really talked about that, but actually that is actually quite important. So if you do manage to identify someone I always do like different things about geolocation, so like background of images, plug sockets. Really think people go, plug sockets. What do you want about, Stuart? Like, no, if you've got an image and you can see where someone is and you can identify the plug socket and know and be able to zoom in on that, you'll be able to identify the location of the country of the attacker by their plug socket, right? There's a whole thing on plug socket intelligence. It's a weird, different thing.
Fascinating.
But I did that for one of the CTFs I did for one of our clients recently. And so, this is the whole point, is that, if you start building up this repertoire of information, you can apply it to so many different situations. It's not just about your malware, it's not just about your threat hunting, it's about also doing it into the attackers that might be targeting you. It could be your internal employees that they're exposing themselves. Are they taking photos of their desk? And on that desk, does it have their badge? Does it have potentially sensitive information? Are they sharing stuff that could then lead to an exposure? That's also one part of the intelligence as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I'm conscious of time. We have 20 minutes left, and I've got a couple of slides. So we started here.
We finished here.
We kind of finished
We're
here.
back with the objective.
It comes back to three things, right? Actually, four things.
Four things.
We'll go 3 or 4, right? But maybe it's 3, right? So having an objective, right? Having a reason for doing this in the first place. Could be validation, could be whatever it may be, right? Understanding the data you're collecting, the quality of the data, being able to verify and analyse that data so you're getting actionable intelligence, and then being able to identify, probably right at the beginning, identify your assets before you do intelligence, but then actually intelligence can be used to identify your assets as well, right? Because you may not know what your assets are, and when you're doing some discovery, you may identify there are some assets that you didn't realise.
You didn't realise you had.
And you can add those,
More
right?
days.
There you go. Shodan's a great example of that, right? You might identify it through
What's this server doing
certificates as well, like domains and certificates and subdomains and things like this. There's a whole bunch of stuff that you could really just go and discover. So please be wary of the fact you may thinking, well, we need to do our asset register. Yes, you do. But some of this intelligence stuff might identify assets you weren't aware of, and therefore you are then continuously improving in security.
Absolutely.
Things like this. Identify your audience, know your audience. Yep. Is this something that's tactical, that's going to go for technical audience? Is it strategic intelligence and looking at our industry, what's happening, big sky kind of thinking, exec stuff, right? Know your audience, right? Know what, and actually it might be the same piece of intelligence is going to be disseminated to different parts of the business. Could be HR, could be execs, could be operational unit in a different country. So know your audience, know where it's been going to. Right? And
that's actually something we haven't touched on, because the threat landscape might be different depending on where the organisation is based.
Geopolitical.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Well, if we talked about geopolitical intelligence, then we're going to be that's a whole different session altogether. I wanted to not go into that rabbit hole just yet, because that's then. But it is part of this anyway. It's part of your threat landscape. Yeah. So you have, and we talked about right at the beginning, we showed the environmental stuff.
Yeah.
Your location, your country you're in, your economical, your industry, they're all factors.
It's really interesting, actually, when you think about all of those external factors that impact on a business.
So you've got different ways and different exposure factors. I am really conscious of time.
You're conscious of time?
I'm always conscious of time. There's a big ticking clock in front of me. It tells me that I need to be conscious of time. Right? Behind the scenes. Right? Anyway, right, okay, so.
Make a plan.
Making a plan. We need to make a plan. And this is basically my checklist for anything I need to do. When I'm doing any kind of intelligence program, when I'm running an intelligence program here, when I'm running for a customer, when I'm helping a client build an intelligence program, when we're doing intelligence for a client, I always have this checklist. I have another complete checklist when I'm finding missing people, but it's not interesting today. But it's the same sort of lines, right? You need to have a plan. You need to make a plan. And what is the plan of attack? What are we trying to prove? What is the objective? You might have mentioned objective once or twice today.
Yep,
once or twice. But it's important. Knowing why you're doing something, or what you're trying to prove, or what questions you're trying to answer is vital, right? What assets are we trying to protect? So if you don't know your assets, but you have a fairly good idea, that's a starting point. Your intelligence gathering activities will might identify other assets you weren't aware of, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? It is a continuous cycle of improvement. So by doing this in the first place, you might identify, even just doing an external Shodan search. Let's go into Shodan Safari in our company. What can we find? My God, what is this asset? Oh. Why is this showing up on Shodan? What this is linked to us? No idea what that is. And it's exposed.
That to the internet.
Yeah, exactly. Why are we exposed?
How long's that been hanging there?
Yeah, exactly. Why haven't we known about it? And why haven't we been compromised yet? Maybe we're not on that list, right?
We don't want to ask that last question. Thank you.
Yeah, exactly. But that is one of the questions. What is that bad? have we already been compromised? Assume compromise at that
Assume,
point, right?
yeah.
Assume compromise, right? What are we protecting those assets from, right? So what assets are we protecting? What are we protecting them from? What are we exposed to? What could we be exposed to? What do we know about, right? What level of controls in place on these assets? The one question is, none. There's nothing. We don't know.
We didn't even know the asset existed.
There's probably no controls. Check the asset register. There is nothing on it, right? That's our Experian factor, as we like to call it, Equifax factor, sorry. You know, that attack, the asset that was exposed to the internet, no one knew about apart from one guy, and it wasn't included in the asset register, so it wasn't patched, wasn't updated, didn't have the necessary controls, all that kind of stuff. And that is why we need to know our assets, right? And of course, we can talk about what would an attacker have to bypass. Well, hopefully quite a lot of things, right? What's the value? What is the value for the attacker? What's the payoff? Right? There's always a payoff, but how much of a payoff is it?
Yeah.
You know? And actually, does that determine the effort required by the attacker? They've got to bypass all these things to get to it.
Is it worth it?
Is there an easier target? Is there an easier target? Yeah. Right? Actually, you know, if the payoff's big enough, actually that is literally leads to our central database of all of our customer data. The payoff is massive, and they'll put extra effort in. They may just find another route. Right? So understand that as well. That comes down to threat hunting and things like this. What sort of information do we have? You know, is that quality data? Do we need to refresh our data? Do we need to refine our data? Do we need to understand back to?
Do we need to enrich our data?
Right, we'll talk about that later.
See, I do listen.
Oh, it's amazing. That's just actually really good. Right? How is the information going to be processed, analysed? So this is one of the things you talked about. We could do it in spreadsheets. That's fine. Not going to be very useful, because how are we actually going to be here? We're collecting hundreds of IOCs. Is a spreadsheet the right thing to do? Probably not. But there might be a CSV file that gets pulled from somewhere that gets uploaded to a database or a tool set that gets processed and analysed. Could be fed into, like, say, Kibana or whatever it may be. So basically, what is our collection pipeline look like? That's what we're talking about here, right? And who is it for?
And this is where we go back to, is it tactical or strategic information? How are we going to present this information, this intelligence, this data that we've turned into intelligence, actionable intelligence? Is it going to be strategic or is it going to be tactical? Who's consuming?
Exactly. Who's our consumer? Right? And that's ultimately really important. But ultimately, like any cycle, right? If you look at the very first session we ever did.
PDCA, Plan, Do, Check, Act.
Well, yeah, and also the very first, you know, the intelligence life cycle, the incident response life cycle, the continuous security improvements, the cycle. We have to go, what do we learn from what we've collected?
What can we do better?
What can we do better? And
how can we improve?
Absolutely.
Yep.
And on that note...
We're going to go look out of our crow's nest and ask for questions.
So I just want to sort of say, actually, before we ask questions, actually, this is it's been...
Excuse me.
That's all right. You okay?
Yeah, I'm fine, thank you. Sorry.
That's fine.
Interrupt your soliloquy.
I had a really good speech lined up then
as
as well.
No, completely ruined.
So I'd like to thank everyone. Which camera am I looking at? Look at this one today. Look at the wide angle. So I want to thank everyone who's joined us through either the first session or joined us in all of the sessions, or maybe just as this is their first one. I'd like to thank you for joining us across the series of ZeroDayLive. It's been an actual pleasure to put these together, and it's been a pleasure to have everyone who's participated, either behind the scenes, so Amy, or the guys behind the cameras, and then behind the scenes, Martin and Aid, and all the other people that have actually helped out throughout this session. And also our guest speakers, such as Steve, or Kevin Swatridge, or Pete Farrell, or Peter Cavanles, and everyone else that's joined us throughout this wonderful season. So this is the last in this particular season. It is no by means the last in ZeroDayLive. But I just wanted to make, everyone who's been part of this and put it together, it has been a pleasure. And it's been a pleasure, hopefully, everyone listening, to be rambled on for the last 6 months. But I've really enjoyed doing it, and hopefully it's given you an insight into the depth and breadth of the things that we can talk about, and also the very challenging topic that is information security and how broad it actually is. So, that is me and my final speech. I'd like to thank you for that. But of course, I'm sure there are hundreds of questions that everyone's got today that they want answering. So I'm going to hand over to Amy, who's going to chuck some questions. Or if you haven't answered any questions, of course, I'm sure you have. Please, now is your time. Forever remain silent, of course. But there you go. So, anything you want to add, Steve, while we buy ourselves some time to get those questions across to us?
I just want to say thank you to you, Stuart, for bringing me on and letting me partake with you in some of these, because I found it quite entertaining and educational, because some of the stuff that I've gotten into with you that we've had to research, particularly around the OSINT, around the threat hunting, has been absolutely eye-opening, because I've come to this very much from used to do IT support, used to do building the networks, putting those servers together. So I'm very much from the old hands-on school. And then when I made that transition into information security, although I went and got my CISP and I've got my auditor badge and all the rest of those things, I hadn't really gone into the world of threat hunting, which is a door that you've opened for me, you've taken me through, and the training that I've had and received and stuff from working alongside you has been absolutely fantastic. So thank you for letting me come on here and be your little sidekick.
Ask me those different questions. Well, okay. Well, if there are no questions, that's absolutely fine. I just, if you want to, if you've enjoyed the chat today, if you've learned something, just say yes to the chat so we can see that. And, if you haven't, let us know as well. But yeah, no, look, seriously, thank you everyone for joining us. I'm okay with no questions, because I think Steve's actually asked me probably some of the difficult questions that you're probably thinking about anyway, that threw me off my game a little bit, so that's good. Right, look, I really, really appreciate everyone who's joined us. As I said, it's been an absolute pleasure doing this. Hope you found it entertaining, informative, and again, we can take this onto social media. If you've got any questions, don't forget to message us on or respond to at ZeroDayLab on Twitter or ZeroDayLab on LinkedIn, and we'll continue the debate there, I guess. So thank you everyone for joining us. It's been a pleasure. I've been Stuart Peck.
I've been Steve Giachardi.
And this has been Zero Day Live.